Hi everyone, welcome to the Legislative Weekly, Ontario edition, with your host, John Wu. On this week's episode, we're going to be covering an upcoming change to the Human Rights Code, energy, and the Ford government's new cannabis legislation. If there's any particular topic you want to scroll to, we have added timestamps right into the video description, which you can find down below. So, first up we have Bill 40, which was introduced at Queen's Park last week. Well, now what Bill 40 does is it changes the Human Rights Code to include genetic characteristics as a prohibited grounds of discrimination, alongside things like race and marital status and disabilities. Now, I really like the idea behind this bill. As a former med-sci student, I can attest to the revolutionary power of genetic testing and its transformative effects on the healthcare industry. It can help us identify so many diseases that we just couldn't in the past and take the appropriate steps in order to prevent them. This will have huge savings, not only in terms of, healthcare and taxpayer dollars, but also in terms of human life and quality of life. A big dissuading factor for a lot of people in going off to get their genes tested is the fear that this information will be used against them in the form of genetic discrimination. Think about movies like Gattaca or books like A Brave New World, where a person's worth is determined by the content of their DNA. It's a very reasonable sort of fear to have. And this bill does take a step in the direction of saying, yes, we recognize that could be a problem in the future, and we don't want it to be the case. Unfortunately, there is a big exemption in this bill for insurance companies. So even if this bill is passed, insurance companies will still be able to discriminate on the basis of genetic characteristics. I understand the economic reasons behind this. Insurance companies need data in order to make decisions on coverage and pricing. I get it. But at the same time, I can't help but feel that this will intimidate a lot of people and prevent them from getting their genes tested. Who wants to risk going off, finding out they have a disease or some proclivity towards the disease, and then on top of that, getting their insurance hiked up by a huge amount based on something that may or may not happen? Sounds like a pretty crappy deal. So yeah, well, I think this bill overall is a move in the right direction. It does raise some problems about the future of healthcare. I think the government, if they really are committed to the long-term health of Canadians, should take steps to encourage people to actually go off and get their genes tested and reward them if they are taking preventative steps towards preventing these diseases. Instead of creating exemptions that will allow insurance companies to, frankly speaking, discriminate against those who are the most vulnerable. So, next up on the list, we have two bills which kind of go hand in hand, in that both of them relate to Doug Ford's promise to reduce energy bills for Canadians. First up is Bill 4, the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act. Now, this bill just passed second reading over at Queen's Park, and what it will do is essentially scrap the whole cap and trade system introduced by the Liberals. For those who are unfamiliar with the cap and trade system, it's essentially a system where companies are allowed to pollute up until a certain point, but if they do exceed that threshold, they're going to have to purchase an additional license from the government, allowing them to produce further emissions. Otherwise, they can face quite a stiff penalty. Accompanying cap and trade cancellation is Bill number 32, which has also passed second reading over at Queen's Park last week. Now, this is the Access to Natural Gas Act, and what this bill does is it enforces a rate protection scheme in terms of natural gases. Now, natural gas is the most commonly used form of heating in Ontario. It's the cheapest and the most accessible. So if this bill passes, it's definitely something that will make this upcoming winter a little bit cheaper for us all. Of course, this does not come free. With rate protection means a huge amount of infrastructure improvement is going to be needed in Ontario's natural gas works. So some serious investments will be accompanying this rate protection scheme, all of which can be found within the bill. So, both of these bills in conjunction should definitely help to lower your next energy bill, which I think is a good thing considering how ludicrous the prices here in Ontario are. This was definitely a very hot topic during the last election, so it is heartening to see the government following up on their commitments. And for those of you who are concerned about the environment, don't worry, environmental accountability is not gone. As part of the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, the government will be required to set a new benchmark for greenhouse gas emissions and introduce a new climate change action plan. As far as how these plans will actually turn out, who can say, but I'm cautiously optimistic. So following up on that thought, we do have Bill 37, which was introduced last week. This is a private member's bill, meaning it did come from the New Democratic Party, actually. And this bill will enact the Climate-Related Harms Act. The purpose behind this act is essentially to set liabilities out for parties who are putting out so much carbon dioxide that it's considered egregious on a planet-wide scale. Now, frankly, I don't think this is going to be a particularly effective piece of legislation. I mean, for someone to be emitting that much carbon dioxide here in Canada, it would take quite a lot. But I can see the purpose behind it. It's clear that the NDP is introducing this bill as a sort of response to the cancellation of cap and trade. And I think this is actually the sort of measure that even conservatives would consider voting for. So yeah, curious to see how far this bill actually gets and if the NDP can actually successfully pass this. Next up, we have Bill 36, which is the Ford government's new cannabis legislation. It has passed second reading in that House just in time, as cannabis is set to be legalized on October 17th. And it brings about a huge number of changes. So the big one is that, yeah, contrary to the Liberal scheme, cannabis will be sold through private vendors, licensed under what will be called the Cannabis License Act. And an interesting part about this act is it will allow some of the current illegal dispensaries to go legitimate by applying for a license, as long as they close down before a set date. Now, personally, I was all for this in the beginning. I thought, yeah, there was no point to spending a huge amount of money cracking down on these businesses now. And yeah, frankly, doing it this way, it does encourage entrepreneurship and small business development. But then a friend of mine raised a really, really good point that a lot of these businesses have gotten a hugely unfair advantage. Compared to people who are doing things completely legally, these businesses have had months to get property, to set up supply chain, to do branding, to get customers, to make money. And they've had time to establish themselves in the ecosystem. Whereas people who are doing it fully legitimately will now have to come into a very crowded market with a lot of first movers. So yeah, I can definitely see how it can seem a little bit unfair that this is happening. But at the end of the day, it is a situation that the government kind of got handed to them. And yeah, they're doing the best they can with it. Another interesting point about this piece of legislation is that in the terms of the cannabis use side, it has changed the use of marijuana to be governed under the Smoke-Free Ontario Act, which governs tobacco. Now, what this means is that you are essentially able to smoke weed wherever you are allowed to smoke tobacco. A sort of stance that the government's gotten a lot of flack for over the past week. They have since clarified that they do intend on releasing additional restrictions. For instance, they don't want people smoking in parks, right next to kids and all that stuff. So yeah, hopefully they do release some restrictions, and nothing against pot. Personally, I don't mind the smell at all. But yeah, I don't think anyone wants to live in a place where there was just weed smoke everywhere all the time. So hopefully the government gets some control over that. Last but not least is a small but potentially impactful item. Bill 41, which was introduced last week, will amend the Highway Traffic Act to allow Sikhs, turban-wearing Sikhs, that is, to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. So this is obviously a controversial sort of bill. Anything to do with a special exception for a particular religion usually is. But I don't see it as the religious aspect that's problematic. I mean, there's tons of religious exceptions being made, and this law has been passed in a lot of other jurisdictions in Canada. What this did bug me is that why do we even have motorcycle helmet laws in the first place? I mean, I get the whole idea of having seat belts and if you get in a crash and you're not wearing a seatbelt, your body gets launched like a projectile and you could really hurt someone else. But if you make the dumb decision to get on a bike without wearing a helmet, you're not really putting anything at risk except for yourself. And frankly, in a free country, I think you should be trusted enough to make decisions like that on your own. Yeah, that's just my take. Curious to hear your thoughts. Feel free to enter them in the comment section below. So, that concludes this week's episode of Legislative Weekly, Ontario edition. Please subscribe for more updates on exactly what your government is doing, and give this video a like and a comment if you enjoyed it. Hope to see you again next week.